In late 2013, in the quiet of a public library in San Francisco, an ordinary-looking young man was staring at his laptop. From the outside, everything seemed completely normal, but a few seconds later, federal agents approached him from behind, and one of the largest black market empires in internet history collapsed in that very moment. But that was not the most interesting part, because what fell apart on that laptop screen was actually the modern version of a much older idea. This story did not begin that day in that library. It began thousands of years earlier, in the winds of the Taklamakan Desert, in mountain passes, in the middle of sandstorms. Welcome to the history of money and gold, and let's read in the comments, because two major details that aren't in the story you're about to watch will be waiting for you there. On one side, a handful of silk, and on the other, a few lines of code. One was being carried in a camel's saddlebag, while the other was flowing through fiber optic cables into the depths of the dark web. At first glance, these two worlds seem to have nothing in common. Time is different, technology is different, geography is different. But when you look at history, not as a story, but as a data set, you see something else. The names change, the tools change, the numbers grow, but the shape of the game stays the same. In reality, what we are seeing are different versions in different times of the same war we all know. Those who want to set the rules of the game themselves, and the empires and states that want to define those rules. The ancient Silk Road was not the product of anyone's grand and flawless plan. No emperor sat down and designed it. No engineer drew its blueprint. Beginning around 200 BC and continuing for centuries, it was an organic network woven step by thousands of nameless merchants, explorers, bandits, and opportunists. It was a vast system of circulation built beyond borders by people trying to survive. Silk, spices, and porcelain moved from east to west. Roman gold made its way to China. But goods were not the only things this road carried. Along those same routes traveled ideas, religions, philosophies, and ways of understanding the world. That is exactly why one of the greatest and purest cultural exchanges in human history took place on the Silk Road. Kings drew maps, but this network operated beyond those maps. It was a living system that no single authority could ever fully own or control. Centuries passed. Then came 2011. Ross Ulbricht was 27 years old. On the outside, he looked like an ordinary young man, but under the alias Dread Pirate Roberts, he was quietly doing something extraordinary, and there were those who did not want that. He was rebuilding the decentralized trade network of the ancient world, this time alone and in digital form. He was fitting the idea of 1,000 years of organic commerce onto a single computer screen. But his goal stood against the restrictions imposed by authorities. Ulbricht's objective was far more radical. He wanted to build a market that governments, central banks, and lawmakers could not reach, completely uncensored, completely free, completely outside of control. This time, the dark web had taken the place of the caravan routes of the ancient world, and what emerged was one of the largest black markets the internet had ever seen. But no one was there for daily necessities. The demand was for drugs, weapons, stolen identities, fake documents, and worse. The darker side of human nature, as in every age, revealed itself very quickly here as well. The system had been built on a promise of freedom, but the first things that entered that freedom were often humanity's most irrational and most dangerous desires. If you look carefully, you can see where the story begins to run in a disturbingly parallel way. Because the similarity between ancient caravans and a digital black market is not just the idea of trade. The similarity lies in how the system hid, how it moved, and how it survived. Ancient caravans did not choose the easiest roads. On the contrary, they preferred harsh and hostile geographies far beyond the reach of the state. Steep mountain passes, endless empty lands, places on maps almost synonymous with death. These were not merely landscapes, they were also security systems. No imperial patrol was willing to go that deep or constantly monitor such difficult routes. Distance was security. Nature was the cloak of invisibility. Ulbricht had neither a camel nor desert passes. His caravans moved inside the Tor network, which made the source of data invisible by bouncing it across the world again and again. Tor was the sandstorm of the modern age. Every buyer, every seller, every transaction was encrypted layer by layer. Just like the nested layers of a giant onion, identities were covered over. In the ancient world, the caravan was hidden by a sandstorm. In the digital world, code served the same purpose, and something else had taken the place of gold. Just as the heavy coins once stamped with the seal of kings had been the common language of trade, the common language of this new world became Bitcoin. At the time, for most people, Bitcoin was either meaningless or too new to be taken seriously. But Ulbricht saw its real value very early. He made it the only currency of his empire, borderless, decentralized, detached from the traditional banking system. In other words, a tool that made tracking more difficult, distributed control, and bypassed authority. This is where the heart of the story beats. Because this is not simply about comparing an old trade route with a new website. It is about humanity reproducing the same idea again and again with different faces, creating a space beyond the reach of the state, writing the rules from within instead of accepting them from outside, building its own economy, its own language, its own route. But the harshest difference between the two worlds was not between camels and code. The harshest difference was time. The ancient Silk Road lived for more than 1,000 years. Empires rose and empires fell. Epidemics struck continents. Cities were founded and cities were abandoned. Yet those caravans kept moving because the world moved more slowly. Change came more slowly. Crises took longer to build and systems took longer to collapse. There was time for everything to be absorbed. In the age of the internet, there was no such luxury. In the digital world, the trade volume of centuries can be compressed into a few months. Rises are sudden. Collapses are even more sudden. A system can go from invisible to being on everyone's radar overnight. When the oldest forces in human psychology, greed, ambition, paranoia, the desire for control, are added to the speed of code and connection, the result is explosions of an intensity never seen in earlier periods of history. Ulbricht's empire lasted only 2 years. But in those 2 years, the potential and the danger of a 1,000-year-old idea in the digital age revealed themselves in full. The system grew. Demand exploded. Money flowed. The feeling of power increased. And then control was lost. After that point, it was no longer just about building a marketplace. It was about creating a challenge too large for the state to ignore. The end of the ancient Silk Road did not come through a dramatic raid. That road did not vanish in a war. It did not collapse suddenly one morning. It simply became economically unnecessary over time. Compasses improved. Ships grew larger. Ocean routes offered trade that was faster, cheaper, and safer. The old route did not so much collapse as slowly lose its importance. It quietly receded into history. But it left behind an immense legacy: printing, gunpowder, paper, a commercial culture, and a civilizational link between worlds. The Silk Road of the dark web, however, was not given such an elegant ending. The modern state does not watch systems that challenge it as if they were romantic stories. It waits. It watches. It is patient. Then it strikes. That is how Ross Ulbricht's world came to an end. Federal institutions moved methodically for months. Every move was observed carefully. And then, in that silent library scene, the story closed all at once. The laptop remained open. The passwords were seized. The empire fell apart. An idea disintegrated as quickly as it had risen on a screen. Ulbricht was sentenced to life in prison, without even the possibility of parole. And perhaps the most striking part of the story lies exactly here. Because history does not repeat events exactly, but it does repeat patterns. When Isaac Newton lost his fortune in the South Sea bubble, and when Bernie Madoff spent decades building a system of lies, the same lesson rose to the surface again and again. Human crowds are vulnerable to the idea of unregulated freedom, quick profit, and unlimited wealth. Systems change, tools change, goods change, routes change, but human nature and ambition do not change easily. The nature of power is always the same. Sooner or later, it wants to crush whatever threatens its authority. Whether you are in the Taklamakan Desert 2,000 years ago or in a public library in San Francisco in 2013, the essence of the war remains the same. On one side are those who want to write their own rules, and on the other are the empires that want to monopolize those rules. In fact, that is why this story is not really about silk, Bitcoin, or a website. This story is about humanity, about our recurring instincts, the desire to step outside the system, the desire to trade without being controlled, the desire to build a world that is faster, freer, and more untouchable. And the fact that this desire ends in almost every age in the same way. There may be thousands of years between the wind blowing across the Taklamakan Desert and encrypted streams of data moving across the dark web. But what moved inside both was the same: the desire for freedom, the appetite for risk, the hunger for profit, and opposition to authority. The goods changed, the routes changed. The trade of centuries was compressed into months, but human desires and the desire for power have never changed. That is why the Silk Road is not merely a story from the ancient world or a scandal from the early internet. It is a mirror. And once you see this pattern, you begin to notice it everywhere. And somewhere, even right now, that same war is still going on.